Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Professor Harold Hongju Koh, who is the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale. He has served as Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the United States Department of State from 1998 to 2001. His publications include Deliberative Democracy with Robert C. Sly and the National Security Constitution. Professor Koh, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you for having me.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Boston. My parents both came as students from South Korea. My father was the first Korean, I think, to study law in America, and my mother is a sociologist.
And looking back, how did your parents shape your thinking about the world?
Totally. My father came at the time when Korea was controlled by the Sungmin Rhee dictatorship. And when it was overthrown, he went back to campaign for the first democratic government of Korea. And when that government was elected, he was appointed ambassador to the United Nations and then minister to the United States. And then his government, the new democratic government, was overthrown by a military coup. And my father refused to serve the dictatorship and spent the rest of his life in America. And that's how I grew up here. So when I became Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy for the United States and went back to Korea, it was in an important way bringing my whole family's life full circle.
And what about the influence of your mother?
Well, my mother's a sociologist, and she's an expert on comparative cultures. She's one of the leaders of the women's rights movement in Korea. And I think she is the person who most influenced me on how to understand human relations. And that's become a critical part of what I do, both as a lawyer and as a diplomat. So
was there a lot of talk about politics around the dinner table as you were growing up?
Yeah, I have 5 siblings. My older brother was Commissioner of Public Health of Massachusetts. He just recently became a professor at Harvard Public Health School. I have a number of siblings who are academics. One of my sisters, Jean Coe-Peters, is my colleague at Yale Law School.
So it's fair to say that your whole upbringing was a transnational process in itself, actually.
Well, I think what I was told quite early was, if you're going to be between two cultures, why don't you use your bicultural background as an asset? And that then immediately meant I should be a diplomat or a lawyer or an academic.
But the final choice was law. Why is that? Just because of the influence of your father or the example he set?
Well, I started out as a physics major, and my disadvantage was I wasn't that good in physics, and I quite literally one day was going to a physics lab and somebody else was going to a U.S. and East Asia course, and I turned around and went to that course, and I haven't looked back. And did you have any mentors in law school or even as an undergraduate? You went to Harvard, I think, in both cases, who really made an impression on you and further defined the direction that your life was going to take? Yeah, in college, 2 mentors. I had Paul Freund, who is a professor at Harvard Law School, and Edwin Reischauer, who is a U.S. ambassador to Japan. In law school, Arthur Miller, who is a professor of civil procedure, and Abram Shays, who wrote about international legal process, and it's really his ideas of international legal process that I've tried to develop in transnational legal process. Interestingly, 2 people who I didn't study with, Steiner and Vatz, are now people with whom I've co-authored a book on transnational legal problems and transnational business problems, which are also part of my whole approach now.
Now, let's start talking about your service in the government, because you actually started early as a law clerk to a Supreme Court justice, right? And that is this junket from the campus to the halls of power. I shouldn't say junket. I mean journey. Let's say journey.
My first year, I clerked for Malcolm Wilkie, who is a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals to the D.C. Circuit. He went on to be ambassador to Uruguay and a very internationalist. He was one of the advisors of the restatement of foreign relations law. I then clerked for Harry Blackmun, who, among other things, I think was the most internationalist Supreme Court justice we've had in some time. Then I worked for a big law firm, Covington and Burling, which was Dean Acheson's firm, and then for the Justice Department in the Reagan administration. And there I worked on the suit by Nicaragua against the United States at the World Court and the ratification of the Genocide Convention. And then I came to Yale, and I taught international trade and international business transactions. Then after 1990, I decided to do more in the human rights area. And I started with another colleague a clinic that would litigate human rights cases. And that clinic started out doing alien tort cases, and then we ended up representing Haitian refugees. Mm-hmm. And soon I was representing Haitian refugees on Guantanamo and argued that case at the Supreme Court. And then we ended up litigating against the Clinton administration. And so it was with a big surprise that in 1998, I get a call from my former student, who is Madeleine Albright's advisor, and he said, how would you like to be Madeleine Albright's human rights advisor? And I said, I spent most of my time suing the Clinton administration. And he said, that's why we want you. You're nobody's yes man, and everybody knows where you stand, and it will give us credibility to have you. Mm-hmm. So I went in, and that was during the period of Kosovo, East Timor, Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. It was the last years of the Clinton administration, and I actually think that was a very good time for human rights, particularly looking back on it from a post 9/11 perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but let me go back a minute. So what is what you've just described is it must have given you amazing insight into the differences being in the ivory tower and then being in the halls of power and seeing this very important distinction between theory and practice. Looking back, what are your observations that you want to share with us about the differences between these two worlds?
Well, my father, I said, was my greatest teacher. In 1974, I was in Korea doing some research for my undergraduate thesis, and there's an attempt on the life of the president, and that was the same, and they imposed martial law. And that same summer, Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford became president, and I called my father and I said, isn't it amazing that the largest country in the world is changing power without any guns or any guns in the street or any shots being fired, and Korea has never had a peaceful transition of government. And he said, that's the difference between dictatorship and democracy. He said, in a democracy, when you're president, the troops obey you. And he said, in a dictatorship, when the troops obey you, then you're president. And that, to me, was the first time I really had a sense of the importance of understanding the world, how the world worked. Another thing he said was, theory without practice is as lifeless as practice without theory is thoughtless. Mm-hmm. And so I think partly because of that, I became convinced that I had to somehow make my academic work relevant to what was happening in the real world. And when I got to the State Department, I was struck, I've said this in a number of settings, that people with ideas have no influence and people with influence have no ideas. The people who are making decisions often have no time to consult anything academic. But if they do, it's not written clearly enough for them to be able to apply it. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the people with ideas who do have time to think about these things often don't present their ideas in a way that they can be used by those who are trying to make decisions. So I've tried to breach that gap as much as I can.
And you're suggesting that the potential for a synergy is very great, but that mediation is required between these two worlds. Is that a fair assessment of what you see?
Oh, very much so. When I was in the government, every day matters would arise on which I'd think, how can I be making this decision in such a short-term focus? Somebody must have written about this. Mm-hmm. Somebody must have put this into a pattern, and I'd like to know what that pattern is. And I would send my staff out to look for these articles and books, but very often what they came back with was so tangential. and so abstract that I couldn't use it. It didn't help me. And I think when I went back into academia in 2001, part of my thought was I need to figure out a way to bridge this divide.
And what is the key to doing that? I mean, having been in both places and know what the common link might be?
Yeah, well, for me as a lawyer, one of my particular focal points is on how law influences political decision making. And I think many political scientists assume that law is somehow there, but it's not really a factor. I think particularly after September 11th, people said, what's law got to do with it? This is just about power. Everything that we did for 50 years creating this legal structure is somehow thrown out the window. I think what I've tried to do in my work is to argue, here's how law affects political choices. If you do things with law behind you, you're stronger. If you do things in the face of law or in violation of law, you're weaker.
Now, my training is in political science, and the old saying in political science is, well, can you really have a system of law, I'm simplifying here, if you don't have a cop on the beat? And of course in international relations there's no cop on the beat except somebody with enough power to take an action. How do you respond to that? Because clearly law is more important, international law more important than it ever was, but as you just suggested, it's harder to make people see that in the first instance.
I guess I'd ask you this. Do we have burglaries in Berkeley?
Yes.
Well, the fact that the domestic law is under-enforced or imperfectly enforced doesn't mean it's not enforced. And the core way in which you enforce law in Berkeley, burglary laws, is not by coercion, but by norm internalization. People internalize a norm against burglary. And I would argue in the same way internationally. There is a system of international law. It's imperfectly enforced. It's under-enforced. But again, the same mechanism is at work. Norm internalization. Why don't nations attack each other all the time and take them over? Maybe it's because they fear coercion or sanction, but in fact it's because of a sense of internalized restraint. Why don't people sitting next to each other in a restaurant in Berkeley get up and start punching each other? Maybe if they did, they might get arrested for disorderly conduct, but in fact it's because of a sense of internalized restraint. So the element I'm trying to find is, what is it that internalizes this restraint? How do you bring international law home? And that's been the focus of my research, particularly since I came back from the government.
And America before 9/11 and the current administration really had an important voice in making that internalization possible for other countries. I mean, we had a lot of power. We could have pushed people around, used force and coercion, but we actually tried to influence other nations by setting up this process of internalization that you've just described.
Well, when I came to the government, the first conclusion I reached was that the rule of law should be on the U.S. side. There's a system of law that we helped to create. We saw it in our self-interest, and we accepted certain constraints because we thought that in the long run, the overall costs and benefits, the benefits far outweighed the costs. So that's why we support various systems of international adjudication. That's why we support the UN system. We need these institutions, even if they cut our own sovereignty a little bit. And I think that in the post-Berlin Wall period, there was a feeling that this is a chance for the system to really become effective. I now view this period from 1989 to September 2001 as a period of global optimism, where people thought we can really use global cooperation to solve global problems. One of those problems is AIDS, another is global warming, another is international crimes, another is terrorism. Then 9/11 came along, and there were suddenly two radically different views as to how to respond. One group said, just forget this, throw it all out the window. The other said, look, the same approach should still apply. Use global cooperation to solve global problems. And I think the administration that came in took the first approach. Let's go it alone, let's do it unilaterally. They broke out of the Kyoto Protocol, they turned away from the ICC, they attacked Iraq with a coalition of the willing rather than with UN support. And now they're surprised when they've alienated the people who they need to rebuild Iraq. And I think that that's what makes this point in time, 2003, an interesting watershed. The question is, will the United States continue to be the world's primary advocate of norm-based internationalism, or are we going to put forward a sort of power-based internationalism as our prime mode of doing business?
Before we talk about the changes under the Bush administration, let's go back, because you were in a pivotal role at a very creative time for moving this internationalization of norms, that whole process further along. Let's talk a little about that, because it's not just the American political tradition of dealing with these problems that was at work, but also the particular leaders, academic ideas, but also really non-governmental organizations and activism. So talk a little about that dynamic and that very creative period before everything hit the fan with 9/11.
The best image that someone gave me about being an Assistant Secretary of State is that you walk onto a tennis court and someone gives you a tennis racket, and they say the balls are going to start coming over the net. And balls start coming over the net almost faster than you can see them, and you start trying to return them. And then after a while you're returning most of them, and then you say to yourself, why don't I hit them to one place? Why don't I have a plan? Mm-hmm. You try to hit them all to the left side. And then suddenly a moment comes where you say, why am I not throwing the balls? Why is my only approach reactive rather than proactive? And then you have to ask yourself, well, what do I think are our proactive principles? And what I tried to do, and I think I talked about it with Albright, with the president, was to say, there are basically four principles we really care about. First is telling the truth in human rights. Secondly, promoting accountability for past violations while promoting reconciliation. Third, with regard to ongoing abuses, present violations, engaging violating countries to try to get them to stop. And with regard to the future, preventing future abuses. And the long-term solution is by promoting democracy. In the end, torture, genocide, these are not diseases, they're symptoms of bad government. And so we tried to promote healthy government. Now, interestingly, here my brother, the Commissioner of Public Health, said to me, I used to treat smoking patients, and then I decided if I wanted to make people not get cancer, I would encourage them not to smoke. He said, if you promote a healthy body, you don't have to deal with the symptoms of disease. Mm-hmm. And I realized in the same way, if you promote democratic government, you don't have to deal with the symptoms of unhealthy government. So those were our focal points: truth-telling, accountability, engagement, democracy promotion. And we had a very exciting period. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was the largest expansion of freedom in the 20th century. The second largest came during the time when I was in government. Nigeria and Indonesia, various parts of the former Soviet Union, all switched to a democratic form of government. And there was an amazing fact which we uncovered, which was that in 1971 there were only 25 democracies in the world. Mm-hmm. And in 2000 there were more than 120. Mm-hmm. In fact, when Colin Powell's people asked me to brief him on what the challenges were for the democracy and human rights policy. They said, we'd like you to start with maybe a presentation of about 15 seconds. And I thought about it, and I said to my staff, get me two maps. One is a map of the world in 1970 with all the democracies in blue and all the non-democracies in red. And then get me another one for 2000, same thing. And then when he said, are you ready for your briefing? I said, you know, Secretary Powell, I want you to look at these two maps. What you notice is there are a lot more democracies now than there were 30 years ago. That the countries that are in red, the non-democracies, are the ones that are giving us the most human rights problems. The countries that are in blue are the ones we can cooperate with the most to try to address those problems. And the major difference is that you now have many, many more countries with whom you can cooperate to deal with a much smaller number of countries. So your success in achieving this policy will be your capacity to mobilize the blue countries to address the red countries. Now, I still think that's right. I think that's what we should have done with regard to 9/11.
It seems like they didn't listen, or some parts of the government.
I think Secretary Powell listened, and I think he had that view anyway. I'm not sure that others in the government listened to him.
As an academic and somebody whose home base is the university, and just listening to you talk yesterday, giving the lecture, the Jefferson lecture, and then today, I have a sense of the strong idealism that motivates you, and by that I mean an image of the future and working toward that as you deal with concrete problems. How do you deal with the situation in government when things go terribly wrong, as obviously happened in Rwanda? That was probably before you were in the government, but you could reflect on that situation where the good guys may not always do as much good as they can at a particular moment.
Well, I think that we learned a lot from Rwanda because there were danger signals that were clearly ignored. And I think what we learned was, and then at the end they were intentionally ignored, to be honest. I think nobody was ready to make the commitment necessary to prevent something from happening. And I think in the end people didn't know how bad it was going to be. And I think the major lesson I take away is when those signals are so unmistakable, you should not ignore them. I think there's a second point as well, which is why do you serve in the U.S. government? I was very lucky. I was a tenured professor. And one thing I decided to myself is there's always going to be somebody in this job. If you care more about your principles than you do about your job, then you will never fail because you'll always be viewed as having principles. And so I have to be prepared to threaten to resign if necessary. Now, it wasn't a bad threat for me because if I was fired, I could go back to a tenured professorship. But I was very struck. 6 American Foreign Service officers resigned during Bosnia before there was a commitment to the Dayton Accords. And I asked a couple of them, why did you resign? And they told me they had gone to the Holocaust Museum when it opened. And they were looking around and they saw cables that were sent from the U.S. State Department about the Holocaust and responses which were essentially saying, we don't know if anything's happening or not. And they realized that they were ignoring similar signals in Bosnia, and that if they did that, they would feel as responsible as if they had witnessed the Holocaust and not done anything about it. So a couple of them came back and resigned on the spot. And those actions, those acts of principle, I think really pushed the Clinton administration to really step up to and face the problem.
Now, we were on a trajectory before 9/11. You've discussed that with us just now, and really a commitment to building this international normative structure. And as you said, this was pushed aside by the choices, through choices made by the Bush administration. I'm curious as to why you think that happened. I know you believe those decisions were wrong, but what is your analysis of the dynamic that would create such a reversal that even went against what many former officials of the first President Bush thought was a way to approach some of these problems?
Well, trying to put myself in their shoes, I think the Bush administration saw a radical discontinuity. I call it Achilles and his heel. You know, on the one hand, we're the most powerful country. On the other hand, we clearly have an Achilles heel. We could be attacked and 3,000 people can be killed. So how do we defend ourselves? We adopt an approach of homeland security, which they construed to mean more security at home and preemptive self-defense toward people abroad. And then I think their focus on human rights shifted from freedom to speak, to freedom from fear was Franklin Roosevelt's famous phrase. I think they thought we need freedom from fear. So I think they essentially inverted the framework by which human rights analysis had been going on for years, because they thought there was this radical discontinuity. Now, I think their great mistake was to underestimate the strength of the legal process that surrounds what the U.S. did. You know, I describe it as a legal exoskeleton. The United States had created a political order, and there was a legal framework that kind of held it in place. Internationally. And the United States designed this. It was designed to help us. We could mobilize it. I mean, for example, we mobilized that legal framework in the first Gulf War to lawfully drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So I think that what happened was the administration suddenly felt this exoskeleton as constraining, and they tried to break free. And it looked for a while as if they had done so. But I think, what we're seeing as I speak, which is in October 2003, that exoskeleton is flexible. It's closing back in. The U.S. government's under a lot of pressure. It's pretty clear that the unilateral actions they've taken have really hurt them overseas and at home. I think they're now trying to figure out a way to get Iraq reconstruction funded. And so I think what it shows is that law is resilient, and that power has to take law into account.
Mm-hmm. Now, in 1990, you wrote a book after your experience in the Iran Contra matter on the National Security Constitution. And one of your arguments there was that foreign policy, and I will state it briefly and you can correct me if I'm wrong, could be made which reflected the constitutional framework, which said that on issues such as foreign policy there is a shared responsibility, that although we have separation of powers, the dynamism between the different branches could make for a better policy, and that in the Iran Contra case that had failed. And you went on to say that you thought that there had been a failure of power sharing because there had been a failure, there had been executive initiative, congressional acquiescence to that initiative, and a judicial tolerance of letting the executive do what it wanted or thought was best. So the question is, does that analysis apply in this situation? I mean, why didn't the system respond sooner to the actions that the Bush administration took, which essentially put aside the framework? Does your analysis apply to what happened after 9/11?
Very much so. I think you stated the thesis well. The thesis of the book, The National Security Constitution, was, at the time, many people were saying the Iran Contra Affair is kind of a blip. It's a failure of certain individuals, Admiral Poindexter, Oliver North. My argument was this is systemic. There are two competing visions of how to run foreign policy. One is executive dominance. The other is what I called balanced institutional participation, Congress, the President, and the courts. And what I was really saying is the principle of checks and balances doesn't stop at the water's edge. That that all three branches have to participate, but that there had been this pattern of executive overreaching, congressional acquiescence, and judicial tolerance, which was building this counter paradigm of executive dominance. Now, the funny part was, after I wrote the book, we went through a period in which the Clinton presidency had great weakness. Newt Gingrich came up, and a lot of people said, "Do you now think you were wrong?" And I said, no. I said, the pendulum will come back. Look what happened right in the wake of 9/11. The president said, "I want a Patriot Act." Congress extremely acquiescent. The courts have, up until this point, not really drawn a line. So we're now in a situation in which finally some cases are working their way to the Supreme Court, particularly about, can you hold a U.S. citizen indefinitely without a lawyer, calling him an enemy combatant? That's the Jose Padilla case. And I think in the end, we're basically looking to see whether the president's power can be restrained by either Congress or the courts. Just analogize it back to the steel seizure case of 1952.
That was which case now? The
Youngstown Sheet and Tube, the steel seizure case. Harry Truman seized the steel mills in Youngstown, Ohio, during the Cold War. The Supreme Court said you can't indefinitely seize American property at home in time of war. Now, if that's so, how can you seize an American citizen indefinitely in time of even a war against terrorism? So what we're going to see now is which image of foreign affairs decision-making will this Supreme Court accept? Will it be this executive dominance model, or will it be this power-sharing model? And I would argue it ought to be the power-sharing model. I think the most important point is the power-sharing model is not just good for Congress and the courts, it's good for the president. When the president goes it alone, he may have greater freedom in the early going based on his popularity polls. But when his popularity starts to drop, he needs the support of Congress, and he needs the legitimation of the courts to carry on a balanced constitutional foreign policy. And I think that's what we're seeing with President George W. Bush now. He started with tremendous popularity, and then, over time, it diminished. And now a majority of the American people are criticizing the way he's conducting our foreign policy. If he had gotten a statute that clearly supported him, if he had gotten a judicial ruling that clearly said he was in the right, he'd be on much stronger footing. And I think it's in his interest to seek those.
And in the case of this particular administration, it seems they've gone out on a limb, and the route they've taken doesn't work, actually. So it's not just that they violated the norms, but the norms were in place for a reason, and now they're out on the limb, which an election may saw off, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that again, it's this idea of a legal exoskeleton that is not just a restraint, but it's also a source of power. If you stay within the legal exoskeleton, you're exercising legal power. When you step outside, you're sacrificing your legitimacy. And the big challenge for this administration, can they fight outlaws while staying within the law? And I think that there's been too much of a tendency to say, fight fire with fire, legal niceties don't count. And then find that we are viewed as big an outlier as some of the countries that we're criticizing. And that weakens our cooperative power, our soft power. I guess I'd put it this way. There are two kinds of power. Joe Nye, the political scientist, says he distinguishes America's hard power, military and economic power, from its soft, cooperative, persuasive power. And I see the rule of law and our reputation for promoting the rule of law, human rights, as a core to our soft power. And we have been squandering that reputation and relying on our hard power. Well, it turns out hard power is good for defeating Iraq. It turns out it's not good for rebuilding Iraq. That we need soft power, and we are sacrificing that soft power. We're squandering it at a time when we need it the most.
And one has the sense that the very problems that the Bush administration are now confronting in Iraq are the ones that we worked on in the 90s, that we were building up a way of thinking about them, working through them, and they sort of had pushed all that off of the table, and now they're foisted by their own petard.
Yes, one argument I made in the Jefferson lecture is, did the United States have an option other than to attack Iraq with the British government in the spring of 2003? And I think the Bush administration framed it as attack Iraq with the Brits or do nothing. And let Saddam continue with weapons of mass destruction and gross human rights violations. Well, I think many people then said, well, if this is the choice, better to get him out. What I've been arguing is that, there was a third way that was developed a long time ago. How was Milosevic removed? The United States put pressure on him, collectively, cooperatively, created a tribunal where he could be tried, encouraged popular democracy to thrive. He was gradually forced to leave. A democratic government replaced him, and he went to The Hague. So if the United States government had used a similar plan, disarm Iraq without attack, get Saddam to leave without military force, we could have maintained our legitimacy without resorting to this radical, coercive alternative. So I think those in the Clinton administration I know have essentially felt like there was a game plan, there was a blueprint that you could have followed, that was followed with regard to Milosevic. Here, they didn't follow it. And they took a route that looked better in the short term, and it's turned out to be much worse in the long run.
General Wesley Clark has an article in the forthcoming issue of the New York Review where he essentially argues that one of their failures was to not draw on what had become an interagency process during the Clinton administration to actually lay out within the government, planning about, how one prepares for the transition to democracy.
In Kosovo and East Timor and Sierra Leone, all of these were post-conflict societies in which major peacekeeping, rebuilding efforts were made. One of the great tragedies of Iraq, Sergio Vera de Mello, who was the UN administrator in Kosovo and the UN administrator in East Timor, goes to Baghdad and he's killed in a bomb attack. Why? In part because the necessary preconditions, the security arrangements and other things weren't established. So I think he knew, even at the time that he was going, that he was entering a much more dangerous situation in which basic groundwork hadn't been laid. It's a tremendous tragedy for everybody that we didn't learn the lessons of the past.
I want to ask you, do you feel that there was a political failure domestically in the United States among elected people in the Congress to oppose the war? Did they not meet the test that you defined in your book?
Yes. First,
yes, they failed.
They failed.
Yeah.
Well, let me give one example. The Patriot Act passed with one dissenting vote, Russ Feingold. The Patriot Act circulated in draft when most of Congress was out of their offices because of anthrax. So many of them didn't even read it. And you're passing a law that you didn't read. It's called the Patriot Act. The authorization for use of force essentially permitted the president to attack any country that he thought was a threat after 9/11. It didn't name names. Declarations of war name particular countries. So it's as open-ended, or is one of the most open-ended authorizations since the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Now, I think with regard to Iraq, the Congress made an absolutely critical error. In the first Gulf War, the president went to the Security Council and he got a resolution authorizing an attack, but setting limits. And then Congress authorized him to use power necessary to enforce the limited Security Council resolution. That was the right sequence. In this Gulf War, 2003, the president goes to Congress and says, just give me a resolution which I can use without regard to whether there's a Security Council resolution or not. So they gave him essentially an open-ended Security Council resolution before the election. once he has that resolution, he doesn't need a Security Council. Once he has a congressional resolution, he doesn't need a Security Council resolution. So then he goes to the Security Council and says, I'm going to attack Iraq whether you say so or not. And then they go back and forth, and in the end he abandons the effort to get a Security Council resolution that would authorize the attack. And then he says quite, in my mind, unbelievably, by the way, the old Security Council resolution justifies today's attack. You know, it's pretty strange to think that France in 1991 was authorizing the attack of Iraq in 2003 when Chirac is sitting there in 2003 saying, I'm going to veto any resolution. So I think that Congress failed in terms of the way in which they saw their responsibilities. They should not have been giving a blank check. Now, I think the president was short-sighted also. He saw this blank check as somehow in his interest. But he's paying a price because now it's Bush's war. You know, it's he didn't have congressional approval at the time. So it was too open-ended, and so now Congress can walk away from the war. So I'm not blaming any particular entity. I think everybody covered themselves with unglory in this episode. The president, I think, acted without real consultation, without getting specific authorization. Congress, I think, bailed out, ran for cover, and I think the courts haven't yet adjudicated, particularly in these detention issues, but their challenge is coming up.
Now, in a way, all of this comes together. All that we've been talking about, the difference between the Clinton and the Bush administration, the new problem after 9/11, that is the threat from either rogue states or terrorist groups obtaining nuclear weapons and trying to use them on the American homeland, dictating in the Bush administration's view a preemptive strategy. In the case of North Korea, actually. So I'd like to talk a little about that. You can bring us special insight at many levels, your background, but also your work as a lawyer and in the government and so on. So share with us some observations how these two contrasting views come together in the question of how to deal with North Korea.
And when I went to North Korea in November 2000 with Madeleine Albright, it was the highest visit by an American official to meet Kim Jong-il. From 1994 to 2001, Kim Jong-il had entered into this agreed framework where he agreed to restrain nuclear construction in exchange for food, energy, etc. You know, basically, North Korea is a failed state under his leadership. And the clear impression that we had at the time was, if we can lure Kim Jong-il into participating in a legal framework, he will start to do things as part of this contractual agreement that will bring him more and more into the world system. It's not dissimilar to the idea of Nixon going to China. What I saw of him is he's strange, but he is not crazy. And he desperately wanted to be closer to the world system. He wants to be part of it. He wants to be, in some ways, recognized by it. Our meeting went very well. And then it was discovered that, in fact, he had been continuing his nuclear development. In other words, this agreed framework had not worked perfectly.
And this discovery was made in the Bush administration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, my view is that's a little bit like discovering that the speed limit is 60, but people are going 65. The fact that the law is not working perfectly doesn't mean that it's not having a restraining force. Nobody denied. In fact, the Bush administration doesn't deny that the existence of this legal framework meant less nuclear weapons in North Korea than there would have been. Plus, it created a framework of cooperation. What they do is they break off the talks, and then start making threatening statements about Kim Jong-il. In particular, this claim that he's part of this axis of evil that includes Iraq. And then it becomes clear that we're going to attack Iraq. Now, if you're Kim Jong-il, you've been cooperating. suddenly, without much change in your own behavior, you're being identified as part of this axis of evil. I think he reasonably concluded from his perspective, I better get myself some more bargaining chips. And he started building more weapons. And then the United States was in a box because at this point, we didn't have the negotiators who had negotiated the previous deal. We'd abandoned the previous framework. We had created this feeling of hostility. And we couldn't use military force because it was too dangerous to use it because of the proximity of Seoul to North Korea. So what happened? After a couple of years in which this whole framework disintegrates, North Korea builds more weapons, we start trying to develop another multilateral framework. We've moved from one agreed framework to an effort to create a second one. And my view is we never should have abandoned it in the first place. I'll tell you, Harry, the greatest tragedy from my perspective was when we flew out of North Korea into the South. There's an incredible moment. In North Korea, it's all dark. There's no electricity. And we flew into South Korea. Then suddenly somebody said, look, there's Seoul. And it was just, millions of lights. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, that's democracy. These people, they're the same people. The only difference between the North and the South is the political system they lived under. And look at all this light, all of this prosperity. And we landed and we went to see Kim Dae-jung, who had worked with my father, now a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he says, I have this dream now. North and the South can be like a federated Germany, and they can try to deal with an organization for security and cooperation in Asia. And we left and we flew back to America, and I said to myself, I'm going to see Korea reunited in my own lifetime. And the thing he said that really stunned me was at one point he said, Kim Dae-jung, this is the president of South Korea, he said, I would like to see the World Cup semifinal played in North Korea. Well, what happened, the Bush administration broke off the talks. The World Cup semifinal was played in South Korea. I don't know if you remember, but the people who played were Germany and South Korea. Mm-hmm. Now, if Kim Dae-jung's dream had been carried out, a reunited Germany would have played South Korea in the World Cup in North Korea. Mm-hmm. Every camera in the world would have been there. The North Koreans would have been cheering for the South Koreans. It would have opened up that country. I mean, think about what ping-pong diplomacy did to China, a much larger country. They never could have closed the box again. Mm-hmm. A process would have begun in Kim Jong-il's North Korea that he could not have closed off. Pandora's box of democracy would have been opened. And I think about that all the time because I think that since then it's been a couple steps back. Now we're moving back in the right direction. But I really do want to see Korea reunited in my lifetime. That was my father's dream, and I'd like to see that dream come true.
As you talk, it strikes me that one of the dilemmas that somebody like yourself, who is an academic with a theoretical long-term perspective, moving to government is the short-term perspective that seems to be present often when one is in government. And I wonder if you would talk a little about that frustration. Namely, you've just laid out a beautiful long-term vision, but in the short term, things don't go the way one would have wished for if one were moving toward the long term. Talk a little about that dilemma of the academic in government.
Well, I think that the academic tends to have theories and tends to have visions, and the practitioner has to get things done. Mm-hmm. And so, the practitioner's focus is almost always short-term, and the academic's focus is always long-term. I think the key, though, is I've tried to adopt a mentality of what I call pragmatic idealism. Mm-hmm. I believe that civilization makes progress. I mean, look at where we are now, 50 years after the Holocaust. The things that are possible now that weren't possible before. And in the end, I think academic theories have to not be based on some theory of collapse or failure, but on some theory of the possibilities of human cooperation. The story that says it the best was when I was in Belgrade in Christmas of 1999, there was a radio station called B92, which had been very critical of Milosevic, and Milosevic shut them down. And in the last days before they shut them down, I guess actually it was December of 98, they asked me to come in for an interview. And I was talking to an interviewer like you in a studio just like this, and the guy was almost in tears. Mm-hmm. And at the very end, he said, "We're about to go off the air." And he said, "What can you say to our listeners that will give them hope?" And I said, Madeleine Albright was born in Nazi Germany. She fled from the communists, and now she's Secretary of State of the most powerful country in the world. My father, was exiled from a dictatorial government in South Korea, and now his son is the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights of the United States. And guess what? Both of our countries are free. The Czech Republic is free. South Korea is a burgeoning democracy. And I said, and Yugoslavia will be too. And, it's true. Mm-hmm. Belgrade is in a post-Milosevic era. So I can be discouraged about 9/11, but I can't look at my own life and not feel as if, as an academic or as a practitioner, pragmatic idealism should not be my focus, and fundamental optimism about the possibilities of civilization.
And really the bottom line here in this positive direction that you're talking about is really what we started with, your interest, namely the effect of transnational processes on both individuals and states, and also the internal processes of those states.
I've come to think of the idea of transnational process as like medicine. When I first put the idea out, a lot of political scientists said to me, "What's your theory? What's your prediction?" As if this was a sort of scientific process that's going to play out. And as I worked on it, I started to think, it's not so much a scientific theory as it is a blueprint for action. And we need able practitioners who are going to push this process along. I don't think human history just plays out inevitably. I think it's contingent on human action. So when people say to me, "What does your theory now predict?" I would say, will the patient die or will the patient live? It depends. It depends on how good a doctor he or she has, and how quickly they identify what's wrong and how far they push for the right result.
So it's a craft, an art.
It's a craft. And my view is there was a choice after 9/11. I think we made a lot of the wrong choices. I think we're now starting to recognize that we made the wrong choice. So, even when we make mistakes, there's a self-correcting nature of this system. But I think, it's the job of people who care about this system and of making progress to push it in the right direction. That's why I'm very inspired by the quote from Robert Kennedy at Cape Town in 1960s. He says, every time a person stands up against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope, which, crossing one another from a million centers of energy and daring, create a tide that can bring down the mightiest walls of injustice. And when you think about it, he's really talking about what one person can do in transnational legal process to change the world. Now, when he said it, he was in Cape Town, and now South Africa is a constitutional democracy. And, I think there are people who are living proof: Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, that, having this pragmatic idealism, connecting intellect to action, theory to practice, has the possibility to change the world for the better.
Professor Koh, on that very hopeful and positive note, thank you very much for joining us and sharing this fascinating intellectual odyssey with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.